Hello and welcome to Bright Wings, children's books to make the heart soar. I am your host, Charity Hill. The purpose of this conversation is to help mothers and fathers identify books that will liberate their children to embrace truth, goodness, and beauty. It's my pleasure to offer you Stories for Strong Boys. After offering you Stories for Strong Girls back in episode 18, some of you reached out to me and asked if I would provide some thinking about what makes a boy a distinctive kind of person, and where is the literature that supports that. So after spending a long time being terrified to touch the topic, both because of what's going on socially and because thinking about this really requires thoughtfulness and nuance, I decided to ask for some help. I reached out to my friend, Dr. William Hamant. William is a theological and philosophical brother to me, whose love and concern for ordinary people is also grounded in an adequate metaphysics. As if that weren't enough. He is the spouse of my friend Anne-Marie and the daddy of 3 highly inquisitive readers. Those things are also qualifications. In short, I trust him. He will be illustrating his ideas with references to middle grade novels, to poems, and the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. We are lucky to be in conversation with William, lucky to be challenged by him. Welcome, William, and thank you for being ready to tackle this topic with me. I don't have a lot of experience. I've never been a boy or a man, and so I'm really grateful to have an expert with me.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be on your podcast. Been listening to it for a couple of years, and so to be on it, it's a real joy. I do have some experience being a dude, so.
Thank you so much for being here, William. Now you're going to help generate the conversation and help us lean into the question about what is distinctive about masculinity and, hey, that book list. So this was a little tough. This is a little provoking because, right, it's really okay to have girl power t-shirts, but we don't see any like boy power t-shirts. We don't see t-shirts that say strong like dad. And, so it kind of, it's a little tense to think about, is it okay? Is it okay to do an episode about stories for strong boys? And frankly, like, is it okay almost to be a boy? Do you guys need to hold back?
No, I think maybe 10 years ago, that would have been a hard question to ask, but I think it's becoming more acceptable because the fallout of boys not being allowed to be themselves and not having strong male figures in their lives is just, the sociological data is just making that, it's just more and more apparent, right? So we can speak maybe in broad strokes and say that boys who grow up without a father are unbelievably more likely to run into all kinds of problems, from drug addiction to imprisonment to violence to, you name it, illiteracy, homelessness, joblessness. The interesting thing about that data that I did see was that it cut across socioeconomic differences. It was every class, it was every race, it was every area of the country. This is just a constant of human nature that, yes, not particular to one group.
Yeah. Yes. William, I'm going to put into the show notes some links to a couple of podcasts that give people kind of a status update on what's going on with boys and men right now. It's pretty shocking. And frankly, a couple of these podcasts were what motivated me to finally get together and with you and do this podcast. We need some other narrative. We need some other story. Some way to keep alive the question for our boys, for our sons. Who am I? Where have I come from? Where am I going? How do I want to be? What good must I do? I think because of this dark period going on for boys and men, such stories are even more important, right? Stories are a way that we get in the skin of another person and we discover what I'm capable of, because I'm trying it out inside another character, right? Because I think, William, analogies have to do with realities, right? And so we really can experience something that changes our desire, that changes what I think is possible for me. Fiction can do this for our sons. And I think because analogies are tied to realities, we can experience truth through fiction. And our lads can experience truth by entering into the life of a fictional person.
Yeah, that was one of my great discoveries when I was a kid, and I read a lot. I'm not so familiar with the literature which is out there for boys now, but I was remembering so many books that I read growing up, and that was the thing that I loved so much about these stories, was that they allowed me to imagine what it would have been like to be another person and to enter into a different time, to have different talents than I have, to realize that it was good to have those talents that I did have, even
Yeah.
if they weren't common among my friend group. I saw characters develop in stories who flourished because they were able to integrate those talents well, and struggle with moral questions that I had perhaps had little tastes of at that point, but maybe not in the same way. And so the imaginative power of literature is that it does get you inside of outcomes from decisions, such that you can see the good and the bad, not just the consequences, but of those decisions themselves, regardless of the outcome sometime.
Yeah, I think stories can really shape a sense of identity and possibility and shape desire, right? Which then shapes
Mm.
choices.
Well, I was thinking about whether those stories most resonated with me that had something to do with my experience. And there's something to that, obviously. I mean, something wouldn't strike you as interesting or even funny or entertaining unless it touched on something in your own life, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but on the other hand, I think one of the things that literature is capable of doing, like you said, is awakening desire for things that are missing from your life. I think about My Side of the Mountain, how Sam wants to go off and live on the farm that his grandfather used to have on this remote mountain in the Catskills. Just his ability to go off and live off of the land, the resourcefulness that took, the amount of preparation it took to learn about what kinds of things can I eat and what can't I eat and where could I live. Those aren't things I've ever done. I've had a lot of backpacking experience growing up in the Scouts, but to that extent, no. And certainly, his great discovery out there in the mountains of the beauty of solitude and being surrounded by those things in nature that you can only hear if you allow yourself to be quiet enough to listen. That's not something that growing up in towns and cities, most people have really extended experience with. For me to read that book, gosh, I read that book so many times growing up, but it always filled me with this desire to have something like that, something of that space, something of that contact with the real world, to have more of that in my life.
Yeah, that book is so marvelous, and there's something. I mean, girls and boys like it, but there's something I think that's particularly masculine about it. I guess we'll have to kind of talk about that. So,
Yeah, well, let me actually just make a comment about that real quick
yeah,
too. As I was thinking about my book list of things that I read growing up that were so powerfully and beautiful portrayals of masculinity, what I realized is that a lot of these works of literature were written by women.
oh, fascinating.
Yeah. So my Side of the Mountain is a really good example of
That's
that.
right. Jean Craighead George is a woman writing about a
Yes,
boy going
right.
out into the wilderness.
Yeah, and you and I have talked before about one of the poems that me and my children are familiar with, "When Nature Wants a Man," which is written again by a woman,
A
Angela.
woman. Yeah, fascinating. Sometimes when it's not your experience, you see the difference a little more clearly, perhaps, and that's why maybe some of these insightful things about boys were written by women.
At the beginning of our of the podcast, and I was thinking about this, just how funny it is to say something that like I have experienced being a guy. um, I was also struck by the fact that in many ways that makes it harder to articulate because it's what's closest to you, your own experience. G.K. Chesterton has this marvelous quote that it's not the most fundamental things about a man are not what he remembers to say, but precisely those things that he forgets to say. So when I think about this question of what makes boys distinctively masculine or what's distinctive about being a boy, the difficulty of wrestling with that question is that imposing it in that way, we can think about boys and girls in isolation from each other or in separation from each other. And it's a distinction without a separation. I think that's very important. And this might lead to some confusion to say it like this, but I think this is a decent way of putting it. I think that it's a mistake to describe the sexual difference as binary, because if I think about binary language, I think about computer language consisting of ones and zeros, and the one doesn't have anything to do with the zero, and the zero doesn't have anything to do with the one. You could have a computer program, I imagine, consisting entirely of ones. I don't think it would do much, but theoretically, I suppose you could do that. You could just write all ones. That's not the relationship that masculinity and femininity have to each other. To conceive of one is to conceive of its being related to and for the other. And so I think what is beautiful and distinctive about being masculine is its vis-a-vis to the feminine. And I think that's a crucial part of the thinking through the question. That's not to say, now the confusing thing about putting it like that is, that's not to say that boys and girls aren't distinct and aren't separate, and that there are more than one way or more than two ways of being human. I don't think that's right. It matters that you're a boy. It matters that you're a girl. But what makes those realities unique, again, is that they are complementary, not binary.
Yeah. Can I just say, as an illustration, I'm a twin mom, as you know, William. And one of the things that would grind my gears the hardest, it was actually people. So my twins are boy-girl twins. What would grind my gears the hardest was people who could only think of my twins as opposites of each other. So if one was a leader in a particular way, the other one necessarily had to be the follower, had to be submissive. They couldn't be a leader in their own way.
Right.
If one was good at sports, then of necessity, people could only think in opposites. So if one was good at sports, the other had to be not good at sports. And really, I better not tell them differently.
That's so fascinating.
And it would drive me batty.
Sure.
Because how do you explain to somebody in a casual conversation that, yeah, they're different from each other, but they're not opposites of each other? And people on the left and the right both wanted to understand difference like that. It was like the only way people could think of difference was in terms of opposites. So all that to say that we all out here need a more subtle understanding of what a difference is.
Yeah.
When we think about the sexual difference, we're not thinking in terms of opposites. So in the Stories for Strong Girls podcast, one of the things I emphasized is that to be a girl, what is distinctive about being the girl kind of human being is that you show the whole world what's true about everyone, but you show that quality, receptivity, in a particularly emphasized way. So to be a girl is to emphasize receptivity. It's also on men's driver's license as well. So everybody's driver's license, everybody's birth certificate has receptivity in it. But for girls and women, we show what's true of everyone in a bolder way. And so what I want to know, William, is if receptivity is true of everyone, but women say this more loudly than men, what is distinctive then about masculinity? Can we do this?
So having listened to your podcast on Stories for Strong Girls, I really loved the philosophical crash course that you had in the very beginning there. I thought that was really marvelously done and incredibly dense and profound.
Thank you.
One thing that you said very beautifully in that introduction was that as creatures, we have all of our being simply as gift. It's given to us. There's nothing that we haven't received. Even the ability to do the things that we do is an ability that we've received, and the strength that we have to do the things that we do, we have that strength because we've received it. I couldn't breathe in a single breath if it weren't for the fact that I was created into a world in which there were plants that were providing me with the oxygen that I breathe. And so it's easy to take independence as the norm or as the standard or as the truth. But all you have to do is pluck me out of my very well-honed environments for it to become obvious how utterly dependent I am all of the time.
Wow, that is just such a mouthful. I just want to emphasize that we take independence for granted. We think independence is our natural state.
Mm.
But you are emphasizing it doesn't take much for us to understand that everything we have, we're given, we're always in this receptive state.
Well, it takes a lot in that it takes a radically different way of thinking than we're used to thinking. But once you start to see that, it becomes just so obvious and just so clear. And if you get used to thinking about those things frequently, then it becomes an occasion for constant gratitude rather than sort of callous indifference to everything that we have been given. So
yeah, think about my side of the mountain. Like is completely dependent on his environment, right? And he's always at risk of he's at risk if he's not.
Well, I think, so one of the things that he does is he tames this falcon.
Oh yeah. Oh
Time
yeah.
chick, right? And there's this beautiful relationship between him and this very majestic bird, which provides for him. And it's an unusual relationship because the animals that we domesticate tend not to be falcons and hawks. So that's, I think, a very good example of one of his dependency. In fact, there's one time when he throws her up into the sky to hunt, and he doesn't think she's coming back based on the way she's flying on that day, and he's filled with this fear that what's going to happen to me if I lose her. But to come back to the primacy of receptivity for us as creatures, it applies to men and to women alike. It applies to everything. It applies to animals. It applies to everything. There's nothing that hasn't been given its being. But there's this old idea in Aristotle that being is act, that the transition from non-being into being is not exactly precisely right, but it's the movement from potency into act. To be and to be in act are, for Aristotle, and I think it's safe to say the entire Christian tradition, those are identical. It's absolutely true, and I completely want to affirm everything that you said in that first podcast about our dignity deriving not from what we do, but from who we are, that we are ends for our own sake, and we're not good simply because we're useful or because we're pleasing, but we're good for ourselves. We're good for our own sakes. We're to be willed as ends and not reduced to means. That being said, there is I think, very complicated but profound and necessary connection between our goodness as simply being and the imperative to act, to do, to produce is the wrong word, but to co-create with God.
Well, and to unfold your being, right?
Yeah.
To go to be being, like sometimes we think of being like, oh, just be, like that means to just be still. That's one aspect of being. But there's this other aspect of being, which is ising. I be not just once, but all the time. I'm ising. I'm kind of whizzing through existence. I exist in an ongoing way. I'm in act, the most active act.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so being in act, like that's also natural.
Right.
That's also like fully natural.
Yeah. One of the authors that you and I are both very fond of was commenting on the Christian notion that we're made in the image and likeness of God. And he says that to be made for love, which is to say to be made for our own sake and to be made to give ourselves away, again, as you also put it in that first podcast, that's the content, the inhalt, the content of our being made in the image of God. Not work, not doing. That's not the content. That's not what is the full meaning of our being made in the image of God. However, working, doing things within the world, like I said a second ago, co-creating with God. To beget children, we speak of as procreating, right? But any activity that we do in the world is to share in God's creativity. And so that activity in the world is a consequence, he says, a folga, it follows from the content of our being made in the image of God. So you can't separate being and action any more than you could separate the sun from the rays of light which come off of it. I've always been struck by the parable of the talents. There's different numbers in different gospels, right? But the one that I'm thinking of is to the one servant is given 5 talents, and to the second is given 3, and to the third servant is given 1. The servant who's given 5 invests the 5 and is able to return 5 more to his master. And the one who's given 3 invests it and is able to return 3 more to his master. But the one who's given 1 is afraid. And so he takes his talent and he buries it in the ground. And his master comes back and asks for it. And he says, I knew you were, this is to me very interesting. He says, I knew you were a demanding man who reaps where you did not sow. And so
and gathers where you do not scatter.
Right. And so I took your talent and I buried it under the ground, and here it is back. And for just staying as he is, that servant is condemned. For failing to act and to bring more into the world, for failing to participate in God's creative power, that servant is condemned. So again, our dignity, our goodness is not because of what we produce or what we do, but there is something good about this call to fill the earth and subdue it.
He didn't unfold. The servant that had 1 talent didn't enrich what he was given with anything of his own. So what's distinctive then, William, about masculinity is being in act, this emphasis. So on everybody's birth certificate and driver's license, we've got receptivity and we have donativity, giving, right?
Right.
And men, maybe what's distinctive about being a boy or a man is realizing oneself, developing oneself in donativity. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right. And I was talking to some friends just yesterday, actually, about C.S. Lewis and his 4 loves. He distinguishes friendship from romantic love. And he says in friendship, there's the posture of 2 people facing the same direction, facing a common thing. And in romantic love, there's the posture of facing each other, right? In friendship, they have something outside of them, which forms the basis of the friendship, that they say to each other, oh, you too. I thought I was the only person who loved this thing. And that's their discovery. And that's the orientation of their relationship. And I was just musing with my friends yesterday that maybe that is true of friendship in general, but maybe it's also particularly true of relationships between guys, because the friendships between women that I know do tend to be sort of facing each other to a large extent. They engage in conversation a lot more than guys do. Guys generally have to have something that their friendship is about.
Yes, I can see that. Mm-hmm.
Now, again, of course, we're speaking in generalities here, and maybe some people might object that that's not very helpful. But these are patterns that I think are true across large swaths of men and women. You always have the problem of the exception, but I think I used to teach bioethics to a class full of nursing students at DeSales, and they were almost all women. And I was talking about the sexual difference once, and how, again, in general, obviously, women tend to be more interested in people and men tend to be more interested in things. And I don't know anybody who's studied any of the sociological data who doesn't know, but that's been fairly well demonstrated. But in any case, it's not something which people hear with any degree of comfort in our society today. So I said this to a class once. I was talking, I can't even remember the occasion for talking about this, but I was talking about this with my bioethics class, and one of the male students in the class said, well, that's sexist. And I said, look around the room, man. There's 35 students in here and you're one of 2 guys. So, I mean, again, there's exceptions, and he was
right. Both items are on everybody's birth certificate.
Both are true for everybody. That's right.
The obvious difference shows a relative emphasis.
I really liked how you called both episodes stories for strong boys and strong girls, because again, we might be tempted to think strength is a particularly sort of masculine virtue, and it might be, I don't know, that might be true in a certain sense, but it's everybody knows what a strong woman looks like.
William, let's name where we're at so far. What we want to propose, right, as a guiding principle for stories for strong boys is that masculinity is a distinctive way of being human. And what it emphasizes about being human is that we are more realized by unfolding ourselves in action. And men in particular, their identity is developed especially by action, especially by going out of themselves.
Yeah.
As well, and adventure and risk.
Yeah, I like this notion that masculinity highlights the need for us to go out of ourselves. At the same time, I mean, that reminds me, again, to temper it with the balance between the masculine and the feminine, that reminds me of something that one of our professors used to say, that life is not about going far, but about drawing near. I think it's important to say, for all of the adventures that compelling characters undergo in good literature, the most important victory that a character can achieve is the victory over himself, the struggle for real self-possession, self-control, the mastery of his passions so that they can be placed at the service of something greater. And that without that internal victory, any external victory is actually quite meaningless. In the poem by Angela Morgan, When Nature Wants a Man, there's this marvelous line that though he may not understand nature, nature gives him passions to command. How remorselessly she spurs him, with terrific ardor stirs him when she poignantly prefers him. So these passions, this drive is given to us precisely so that we can rule over it. That's not meant in a dominating sense, but in a harnessing sense, so that we can channel these good powers that have been given to us by our Creator and put them at the service of, again, unfolding our being and the being of the world.
I really appreciate you quoting that poem, When Nature Wants a Man. I'm going to put it in the show notes. And I want to hear more from you, William, about this. I want to know what kind of stories, what kind of poems impacted you when you were a boy. What are your reflections on it now? And what is it about these stories that highlights masculinity for you?
Stories that I read growing up that I think were particularly good at highlighting what it is to what is good about being a boy, what it means to be a boy, and what it means to grow into a man. So I think that the themes that were most resonant for me growing up were books in which the main character had to strive for some kind of excellence. And I think about Where the Red Fern Grows. He wanted to be the best hunter and to have the best coon dogs in the whole county, right? I think A Banner in the Sky, the author to that is Ullman, I think is his last name. That's a story about a boy who grows up in a mountaineering town and whose father was an accomplished mountaineer, and he tries to grow into that. My Side of the Mountain, where, again, you can't just go off to a mountain and wing it. His escape to the mountains took a lot of preparation and a lot of study, and he required a lot of help.
Ah, okay. What other themes were important to you, William?
Other themes would be where the main character stood out for his intelligence, and the Great Brain series was always a favorite of mine. I've read those probably over a dozen times. Where the main character is facing some kind of danger or injustice. There were two historical fiction authors who were brothers, Collier and Collier, who wrote a number of different books that took place primarily during the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. One of their books, I think it's War Comes to Willie Freeman. I think that's the title of the book. And Willie Freeman she's actually a girl. She's a female slave who is escaping to the North, and she has to disguise herself as a boy in order to do so. That was kind of an interesting book to think about for this podcast, because it drove home for me the point that the stories that are compelling for boys don't have to be simply about boys. That doesn't have to be the main character. Good literature, again, as you said in that first podcast, it's just good literature. I think it was Duke Ellington who said there's two kinds of music, good music and the other kind. I think that obviously applies to literature as well, and I certainly I guess I would say it's probably fair to say that the stories that I loved and read growing up primarily had male main characters, but not exclusively. A Wrinkle in Time, for instance, The main
Yes.
character in that is a very strong female. I mean, obviously there are male characters in it, but the main character is Meg. I think other themes that were striking to me, I remember certain scenes in books that I read where the young boy would be captivated by the beauty of a young girl. There's this girl that Johnny Tremaine is taken by. I think she's the daughter of the silversmith that Johnny Tremaine is apprenticing with. I remember reading that and just speaking to me of that mysterious call of feminine beauty that resonates for masculinity, even from a very young age. It's this sort of promise, this offer of joy. And there's something dangerous or risky about it too, because it's a fragile sort of thing. Love is a very fragile thing. It can be easily lost, but only difficultly won. And so I remember thinking about those themes even when I was a kid, not explicitly, obviously, but anytime a strong male character would encounter a female character that he was captivated by, those were the things that spoke to me. Like you said, adventure and impossible tasks. This is kind of a dark trilogy, but the Tripod trilogy by John Christopher, that's the author. We read a chapter of that book in a literature textbook that I had in maybe fifth grade. And I loved the one chapter so much that I went straight to the library and got the whole series.
Cool. I
But
will put that in the book list for this podcast.
Again, it's a little bit dark. It's set in this dystopian future in which, aliens have enslaved the human race by putting metal caps on their heads that control their thoughts and make them subservient to their alien lords.
Well, we're almost there.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So what's funny, there's a prequel which he wrote that's set in modern times. And when the tripods came, I think it's called, I read that to my middle son. He's listening to the story with just eyes really wide and said, oh my gosh, that's exactly what's happening now. Totally unprompted, but he saw all these parallels.
Dad, is it fiction? So great.
So to dig more deeply into that, and I think about My Side of the Mountain, and again, this is a story written by a woman about a boy. So, sometimes the harder things to see about ourselves are the things which are most deepest to ourselves, and so the vis-a-vis of the woman can show that to us. But yeah, I mean, he goes off to live off the land by himself. And so it would be easy to interpret this story as being primarily about independence. And I don't think that that's Sam's motivation at all. His family is living in, I think, New York City, right? Because he escapes to the Catskills. Yeah, they're living in New York City in a very small apartment. There's no room for his own uniqueness to stand out. And he's swallowed up by this city in which the masses of millions just make every individual anonymous. So he's seeking to go back to the land. He's seeking to go find a space for himself. And I think it's really crucial that this plot of land was owned by his grandfather, right? So he seeks to discover himself by returning to his family's roots. So there's a really strong theme in this book of reclaiming a birthright that we've been deprived of because of the shallowness and the mechanical nature of contemporary society. He wants to spend time learning how to live there in secret, right? He builds his home out of a tree, he hollows out a tree. And so he has a home that nobody can see.
Yeah, he's actually like taking up relationship. I've never seen it that way before, William. I did see it as a book about going out, being independent, rather than really recognizing the interconnectedness and the relatedness, entering into the relatedness of things, family relationships in an interesting way.
Yeah, I mean, so, there's the scene when he first comes onto the mountain and he discovers the old foundational wall of his grandfather's farmhouse. And he just sits there and there's this line where he says to himself, I couldn't believe I was finally there. He's just resting in that moment of discovery. It's not like, thank goodness I've left all of that nonsense behind. It's thank goodness I've arrived. It's so beautiful. The great task for him is to attain the competence that is necessary to face the challenges of living in harmony with nature. And again, I think that's a really important theme, because like I said, love is, it's very difficult to win and it's very easy to lose. It takes competence to do something which is difficult, but all true goods are difficult goods. He doesn't think for a second, he's under no illusion that what he's doing is easy, but he's convinced that it's worthwhile. I love the journal that he keeps because it shows young children a level of reflection and interiority that so many of our children are deprived of these days because of the constant stimulation of a society that's saturated by technology. It's not true that he's up there simply by himself. He does have human visitors from time to time, and those scenes in which he has visitors come and stay with him are filled with joy and discovery and mutual exchange. So it's not a portrayal of society or friendship as bad, right? It's not a story about a loner at all, actually.
William, I just want to say I'm really impressed by this reading of My Side of the Mountain as a story about coming into one's identity, going out of oneself, so to speak, going out of the city, but entering more deeply into the relatedness of things, more deeply into family identity, entering more deeply into my relationship with nature. That's something that makes me who I am. There's kind of an independence there, but really it's a relative independence that allows Sam to enter actually more deeply into the relatedness of things. And that's what allows Sam to mature. That is just such a great reading, William. I really like that understanding of masculinity. I want more. What else have you got, William? What else?
Another story that I have read many, many times is Ullmann's Banner in the Sky. This is set in Switzerland, I think. The main character is a young boy named Rudy. He's very small. He doesn't have the build that all of the other mountaineers in the town have, and they call him the name Angel Face. They don't think he'll ever amount to much. But his father was a strong, perhaps the strongest mountaineer in their entire village. And he dies on the mountain that no man has been able to conquer, because one of his fellow climbers fell and I think broke his leg. Rather than leaving the other man, he stays with him on the mountain, even though a storm has come up, and gives him his sweater, and he dies there on the mountain, sacrificing his life to try to save the other man's. And so Rudy grows up, in this town without a father. He has a great natural gift for mountaineering that nobody knows about, because he always steals off to the mountain in secret to climb. And one of the awesome things that the book teaches, especially young boys, is that it's all well and good to have natural gifts, but those gifts have to be developed through long study and discipline. Because one of the days that he's out there by himself on the mountain, he encounters an Englishman who's one of the most famous climbers in the world. Later on, that Englishman invites him to go climbing with him, and Rudy gets them into trouble because he just wants to wing it. And so that's his first real lesson in the fact that the real climbing, again, it takes technique, it takes discipline, and that can only be learned through practice. So he has to learn that to be a man who is respectable, who can be honored by his fellow men, it's not enough just to be good at something, but you have to have learned how to cooperate with others in a way that earns their respect. He has to learn that there's a profound shame in doing something reckless that endangers the lives or the accomplishments of other people. He has to come to know through experience the goodness of men coming together to strive for a common goal. And that, just saying that actually makes me remember another line in When Nature Wants a Man, when Morgan says, then to test his spirit's wrath, hurls a mountain in his path, right? Nature hurls a mountain in his path, puts a bitter choice before him, and relentless stands over him. Climb or perish, so she says, watch her purpose, watch her ways. Nature's plan is wondrous kind. Could we understand her mind? Fools are they who call her blind. So it's built into our Constitution to have been given certain things, but to have this task of developing them. And as you said so beautifully, right, unfolding it. I think another strong theme in this book, just like on My Side of the Mountain, is Rudy's connection with his tradition, right? So to be a father is not just to hand something on, but to hand on precisely what has been given to one. he wants to be a climber after his father. He wants to be a climber like his father was before him. And that is to say, this book is really, it portrays a beautiful image of being indebted to the past and honoring it, the goodness of accomplishing more than my ancestors did, but only on the basis of the fact that they've given me what they have. So we live in a society that is totally, we have so little gratitude.
Awesome.
We have so little gratitude. We think everything that we have, we've accomplished. And so both My Side of the Mountain and Banner in the Sky, awesomely portray entering into a tradition and honoring it by living it well as oneself, but nonetheless in a way that picks up what has been passed on to me. I think another great book that describes this is Danny the Champion of the World by Roald Dahl. Now, I did always, at growing up, have mixed feelings about Roald Dahl.
This is interesting, William, because you mentioned two books about boys who are entering into, they're honoring their indebtedness to the past. They're taking up a tradition that they didn't make up, and they're making it their own. And they're entering into their masculinity through action. They're unfolding who they are. But Danny the Champion of the World, what struck you about this book was, well, why don't you tell us? What struck you about this book, William? I interrupted.
No, that's right. I mean, that's the two sides of the tradition, though, right? Is that to receive with gratitude and with a sense of responsibility what has been given to me, so that I, in turn, can hand it on to someone else. I mean, the joy that a father feels when his son gets excited about the same things that the father is excited about, or at least about analogous things. To think, okay, my life has been of worth because I have passed on something of value that is appreciated as valuable to the next generation. That's just one of the great joys of being a father, of being a parent.
That reminds me, William, my little girl was next to me in church and she was singing with her whole heart. And I just started to cry because I thought, well, maybe I haven't wasted my life. Look, here is something.
It's one of the great joys of partaking in a tradition, to think I'm doing the same thing that my ancestors were doing 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. I'm using the same words. I mean, prayer is like that for me as a Christian, right? To pray with the same words that I know were prayed literally 1,500 years ago. Mm-hmm. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary sort of reality that we're in. So no, I think that's an interesting point, that the masculinity that's really beautifully comes out in Danny the Champion of the World is the masculinity of the father. And to think about this book and what is it that makes this man a great father? It's a little risky to say this maybe, but I think one of the things that makes him a good father is that he allows for the breaking of some rules.
Wait a minute. Just joking. Keep going.
Well,
Keep
because
going. So he allows for this. I have never read Danny the Champion of the World. I've read some other Roald Dahl, and I don't always love him because sometimes his adults are weak.
Yes. Yeah. No, not at all in this book.
And it's the kids who are smart and clever and save the day.
Fair point. Totally true. Yeah. And I agree. But that is not, that's not the tone of this book at all. He's a very compelling figure for Danny, and Danny, it's told from the first person perspective of Danny, who's telling us about his father. He commands a lot of respect from Danny for many reasons. So first of all, Danny knows that his father puts a lot of effort into the father-son relationship. The wife has died shortly after Danny was born. And so he grows up on a little plot of land that has a filling station, gas station with a little mechanic shop attached to it. And they live in a one-room gypsy caravan that has been parked on the property. That's their entire inhabitation. So that's where they live. So It's a very simple existence. And he knows that there's a line where he says, I think that my father since he couldn't lavish all of the love that he had in him upon my mother, lavished it upon me instead. So he was always surrounded by a deep and generous love. He was part of his father's daily life. He describes his early years as growing up in the mechanic shop, And he says, by the time I think it's 5, by the time he was 5, he could take apart an entire small engine and put it back together by himself, which is an extraordinary picture to present to boys today, right? To say, wow, like mechanical know-how, knowing how things work and dissecting them and understanding them and having, again, competence. I think that's a very important word, having competence with them it's a good thing, right? And it's so much more interesting than just like clicking the buttons on your gamepad controller or whatever to make characters on a screen move. At the end of the day, he's got an engine, and like, what do you have? So anyway, I mean, he grows up in this environment. The land is surrounded by land that's owned by Mr. Victor Hazel, who's this wealthy evil man. He's not a good guy, and he's constantly driving past the filling station and has this attitude of wanting to gobble up this little piece of land, which isn't his kingdom. Isn't part of his property. And so there's this atmosphere in the book of struggle against forces which are bigger than you, with very humble resources, but resources that are good and are worth defending.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that the powers that be of the world would probably rather give that tiny plot of land to the wealthy landowner, to Hazel. And so when I say that, it's one of the interesting things that makes him a good father is he allows for some breaking of the rules. It's not a random breaking of rules. It's rather he's teaching Danny what it is to challenge bad rules, but to honor good rules. And his own authority as a father over Danny is based upon his love for him and his care for him. There's this great line where Danny describes his dad as a wildly funny man, but he says, but people who didn't know him wouldn't know that because he seldom smiled. And then he said, but that's to say he seldom smiled with his mouth. He was an eye smiler. And so, which can't be faked. You can fake a smile with your mouth, but you can't fake a smile with your eyes. And so you knew when my dad was smiling, it was genuinely funny and he was genuinely joyful. And he's always that way. The dad is always that way, except when he's talking to Mr. Victor Hazel. So his father can be dangerous, right? He's got power. He's not a pushover. His quietness is not weakness.
Yes.
Right. But he is, in spite of his strength, still incredibly playful, and he's creative in his play. So with his son, he does these tremendously huge projects. He builds this soapbox car that really runs for his son. For one of his birthdays, he teaches him to make hot air balloons out of wire and paper. Those are dangerous things, right? These are not, they would come with a lot of warning labels if you were to buy those things in the store today. Everybody would be wanting to cover their rear ends, because you could get hurt with these things. But his father allows him to have these toys, these things that are creative, right? You have to know how to build the hot air balloon, right? You have to know how to run and care for the soapbox car. By doing these difficult projects with his son, he teaches his son's imagination that the possibilities are quite limitless or much more expansive we might limit ourselves to usually. And he gives him a sense of the goodness of real and tangible work. Yeah, the quality of knowing how to fix things. And I think that is true both for the father's work and for the father's play. The tangible things, real things, are qualitatively different and infinitely better than virtual things. But there's not, in spite of this play and the fact that these things that he plays with the son with, he's not reckless. He sets down very firm rules about when Danny can fly the hot air balloons, for instance. So he's taught respect for reality while not being overly protected from it.
He allows risk, right, for Danny's development.
Right.
And yet human limits are really important also
Right.
Forming your son.
Right. Yeah. I said the possibilities of imagination are limitless with actually kind of a lot of hesitation. And in the back of my mind, I'm correcting myself because that's not true. I mean, reality does have limits. It's important to push those limits, but it's also important to have respect for them because our nature is a given. I wouldn't think with any gift that somebody I love gave to me, I wouldn't think just because it's mine now, I can do whatever I want with it.
Ah,
Right. I would receive it according to the logic of the gift, the action of the gift, the thing itself, the person who gave it to me. I would receive it according to those terms, and my respect for it would be informed by that, by receiving it according to, yeah, again, all of those parameters.
yeah.
And so reality is like that. And I think where the red fern grows, it's a story about loss, right? So there's limits there. Banner in the sky, he's struggling against a mountain which killed his father and very well could kill him. There's limits. You might be familiar. I think you're familiar with the famous speech by Teddy Roosevelt, the portion of which is not now known as "The Man in the Arena." That's another bit that I will recite with the boys, because I've always loved that as a great example of manly striving, but also the worth of being willing to die for something. That striving doesn't always end in victory necessarily, but it doesn't lose its worth thereby.
William, do you have it in front of you or could you recite it
Sure.
for us?
Sure. Yeah.
I would love to hear you recite it.
Okay.
Hey, wait, let me back up a step. So back
Okay.
when I did a podcast on poetry, why poetry, and I alluded to a wonderful father who recites poetry to his children before they go to sleep. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the man, William Hamant. So I would love to hear you recite The Man in the Arena by Teddy Roosevelt. William
Okay.
Hamant, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, hopefully I don't mess up the words now that I'm on the
All right.
Okay. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great ambitions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat.
That's so great.
I mean, for me, what this points to is that real struggles are difficult. There's that Coldplay song, right? Nobody said it would be easy. No one ever said it would be this hard.
This is such a great tune.
It's such a
Capital
great
T. Yeah.
But that we get into these things that again are worthwhile. Every real good is a bonum arduum, is a difficult good. So I like the realism with which Teddy Roosevelt faces difficult goods in this little portion of that speech. And without relativizing, without diminishing the importance of success. I think Teddy Roosevelt here very correctly relativizes the importance of success because, again, as I said earlier, the real conquest is not simply the external conquest of the material world, but the conquest of my own passions and the building up of my own character, the growth towards virtue. So the point that is very clearly laid out here in this portion of the speech is that it's not so much about winning as it is about giving it absolutely everything. And I do think that it teaches that some things are worth dying for. I've been part of certain struggles over contemporary ideologies, shall we say, in the last several years of my life. I think one question which people ask themselves in those moments are, is this the hill I want to die on? Let me just say it's better to die on a hill than to just let evil have the day and then at the end be left thinking, gosh, I wish I'd picked a hill to die on. So obviously we don't throw ourselves away for little things, but we have to realize what's worth fighting for and that might not result in quote unquote success.
I'm wowed. Yes. Honestly, I think if there is a sin that's particularly odious in a man, it's apathy. And if there's something that I admire especially in a man, it's thumos, spiritedness. So, yeah, I think pick a hill because we're all going to die.
Yeah, there's this great scene. I had a friend in Pennsylvania who pointed this scene out into the Bible, from the Bible out to me. I'd never noticed this before. And I should take a second maybe to look this up, but it doesn't matter. King David has, I think, 3 strong men or great warriors that are described very briefly in, I don't know, I'm going to butcher this, but probably First Kings or something like that. Anyway, he's got 3 strong men whose praises scripture sings. And all we know about this one guy that's praised in that passage is that he defends a bean patch against this whole onslaught.
You're kidding me.
This whole onslaught of an army coming at him, but standing alone, he defends this bean patch. And my friend, he was reflecting on his own family when talking about that passage, and he said, my family is small, it's not much, but this is my bean patch, dang it.
That's so awesome. That is so awesome. William, this has me thinking about a quote from The Old Man and the Sea. My 9th grade daughter was just reading it. The old man is his character name. The old man says, "A man can be destroyed, but never defeated." And the 9th graders were puzzling out what could this mean. And I think what it means is what we're just talking about.
William Ernest Henley's poem Invictus, which I think came onto a lot of people's radar when Morgan Freeman played Nelson Mandela in the movie of that name with Matt Damon, the movie Invictus. That's also a phenomenal poem for the possibility of genuine triumph of the spirit, even when in worldly terms there's been nothing but defeat. Henley suffered a lot in his life. He had a leg amputated from early tuberculosis of the bone. So he knew a lot of suffering. But in that poem, it still reflects the ability of a man not to be spiritually conquered, even when he's been physically conquered. There's a famous essay by Joseph Ratzinger called "Truth and Freedom" or "Freedom and Truth." I can't remember which the order is. He quotes, I think, Rousseau, which is a funny guy for him to quote, but he quotes Rousseau, who says, "Man is free even if he is born in chains." There's something really beautiful about that no matter how much my body or my circumstances can buffet me and pummel me, those things can't conquer me unless I let them.
I think for every human being, life has probably turned out differently than they expected, both regarding its joys and life's sorrows. I guess I'm wondering, it would be great to hear from you, William, a mature reflection from a man who is a son and who has become a father. How are you working towards not just an exterior victory, but an interior victory, since you're at a more mature point in your unfolding?
One of the factors in the stage of my fatherhood right now is that my kids are older. They're older than they were. My oldest is now 13, and my 2 younger ones are pretty mature, 11 and 9. A father has to learn how to allow his children to come into their own. There's always a risk in that, right? Because nobody wants to see their children fail or fall into or make mistakes. It's proper to protect little children from those things, but it's quite improper to have that same approach to children as they get older. So I think one thing that I'm working on right now that I'm learning is what it means to allow myself to step back, and what it is to make room for children's own personalities to flourish and for them to step into their own and to take more and more ownership of themselves. So I'm working on that. I wish I were more like Danny's father. I wish I were more patient.
I love that reflection. I wonder, in light of everything we've said about masculinity, if you could reflect on your experience of work.
For my work, I was a university professor for 7 years, and for a few years adjuncting before that. And the work that I'm doing now is not related to that almost at all. Making sense of that, making sense of the unexpected things that can come into one's life is difficult. So I'm working on trying to entrust myself to the path that I do think God is guiding me on, and to follow it as best as I can. I'm working on having, a joyful acceptance of the challenges that are proper to my work now. Yeah, accepting them with joy as something that is. These are challenges which I wouldn't have set up for myself, but they're challenges that have been given to me, and so to realize that they are forming me, and to not be eager to necessarily see the next bend in the path, what's beyond the next bend in the path, to be patient with where I am now, to accept it on its own time. So, for all the talk about what's distinctively masculine as kind of action, maybe outward facing kind of doing, I'm learning the difficulty of the primacy of being, I think, right now. I'm not doing that necessarily well all the time, just to be clear.
Well, the primacy of receptivity as something that grounds your identity, that sounds like you're going more deeply into your identity, especially since your external work is different than you anticipated. It's not so obviously a field for your own development.
Right. And I, for so many years of my life, I mean, really since I was a sophomore in high school, I had in mind that I really wanted to teach, and I love teaching. So not to be doing that is unexpected. But, I remember I was at a conference for the American Maritime Association a few years ago, right before COVID. A discussion arose after one of the papers about what do we make of that period at the end of our lives if we are blessed to grow into old age when we're not doing so much anymore, and we have re-entered into that stage of the primacy of receptivity, or at least when the primacy of receptivity is more obvious, let's say. What's the worth of talents that we had developed if we lose them just by normal old age, even more dramatically in something like Alzheimer's or something? And so I try now to see my time as a teacher, which maybe is not over, who knows, but I tried now to see my time as a teacher in light of a comment that I made during that conversation. I said, I see time as enfolded by eternity, thinking here about maybe the last battle of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, that heaven is the Narnia within the Narnia, but within heaven itself, there's deeper and deeper Narnias. That reality is kind of inexhausted, and that nothing. And when they go into the true Narnia, when they go into heaven, nothing. It's everything that they loved about Earth perfected. Nothing good is ever lost. After the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes, Christ commands his apostles to gather up the fragments so that nothing is lost, right? Which I just love that line. So anyway, in the context of this conversation, I said, time, it seems to me, is enfolded by and protected by eternity, so that even if something lasts a brief time here on earth, if it's genuinely good, it's preserved eternally. It's always there. Its goodness lies precisely in the fact that we have lived it well for the time that we've been given to live it, and made of it an offering to eternity, and have allowed eternity to receive it, which means that we have to allow ourselves to let it go. St. Peter is told by Christ on the shore after the resurrection that when you were young, you used to, dress yourself and go where you wanted, but when you grow old, somebody else will dress you, and you will stretch out your arms and be led where you do not want to go. It's such a poignant scene where he's being told, the good that you've accomplished in this life is all to prepare us to make a final offering of it and a final surrender of it to God, in the confident hope that nothing good is ever lost.
Perhaps another way of saying it is that as sons, which you are always receivers, and that even as you mature and grow to be a father, grow to be someone who is especially distinguished by donating in a mature way, his self, all this self-realization through action, right, through donation, prepares one to lay down one's life in a final act of donation. And this donating, right, risk attaches differently to donation than to reception. And saying what you said, that nothing good is ever lost, is a way of ensuring that this risk, we know it has a final beatific ending. That's the hope. William, this has been a huge, huge conversation. I'm super spoiled by you reciting poetry for us, by you reflecting on literature with us, especially sharing some of those novels with us. I'm super blessed to have you as a co-thinker for what makes masculinity distinctive. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm so grateful for this conversation. I can't tell you how blessed I am by your friendship and to know you and your family, and to be able to take part in this podcast that I have admired and enjoyed for a long time. So it's great to be here. Thank you.
Friends, I have great news. One of the best book lists ever is in the show notes of this podcast. So go and get it. I have to say, sorry, girls. I didn't mean to give the boys the better book list, but man, this book list for your boys is amazing. I just kept finding books for it. All I can think is that it must be because you boys need it more. Print it, take it to the library, share it with friends. Craft a library out of it. I have personally read each of the books on the list, and it would take me forever to tell you why I put each of them on it, but I just want to say I recommend each of the books. Also, just a flag for you, a couple of them have asterisks, and that is because there's content in there that's worth a conversation with a parent, or it's meant for an older child. There are both picture books and middle grade novels. There's a bit of nonfiction. There's a huge variety of ethnicities, historical time periods, and literary genres: fantasy, historical fiction, adventure, contemporary fiction. It's an amazing list. Enjoy it.